might remember, Alex, that a week or two ago we had a discussion on the show where we were talking about different editions of tabletop games. We were mostly talking about D&D as well as a few others. And we mused a little bit about what we might expect D&D 6e to be.
Well, we kind of put the question up there, but I don't think we really had any thoughts on what it might be. Too much, not too concrete.
Yeah, we didn't really have any ideas of what we might want to change from 5. I think we were more or less trying to determine, like, if it was going to come out and when. But now, thanks to our Discord channel, we have kind of an answer? Let's see if we can explain this. So, thank you to the folks that are in our Discord channel. Specifically, Datum brought this to our attention. That in 2024, Wizards has announced that there will be a new version of D&D. Now, the thing about it is that that does not necessarily mean we are looking at 6e. In fact, it sounds like this is going to be a little bit more like a 5.5, I guess, if we're using the general conventions of what we've seen before, right? Because we had, what, the 3.5 that was still 3, but it wasn't really 3.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. One of the reasons why we are thinking that that might be the case is that this is actually going to still... what the new version is going to be is still going to have compatibility, or at least this is what they say, is going to have compatibility with 5e, so you'll still be able to use those rule books, and that makes me think that it's not really a full new edition, because it wouldn't work that way. In previous generations, that's not how it worked.
Yeah. 3.5 wasn't too far after 3, but it did change some things. And I think made a bunch of other things better. I'm not entirely sure because I didn't do 3, but...
What they said, this originally came up in day 3 of the D&D celebration that they did. So this was streamed on September 26th. And there were some comments, at least in that live stream, where people were wondering about additional rules and adventures that might have been made for 5e, and whether those would be compatible if they have additional rules or subclasses. But, and correct me if I'm wrong, those shouldn't really be affected if they're able to use 5e as a system. Any of the adventures would also be compatible, unless I'm missing something.
In theory, I mean, we don't know all of the details, but if it's compatible, they should be relatively easy to use with it. There might be some changes depending on what they do for 5.5, as it were.
Right.
For whatever this version changes, there may be just like, oh yeah, that functions slightly differently. And then maybe it's like, oh, this mechanic or dungeon had this one gimmick in it that no longer functions the way it was intended. That could definitely happen.
Okay.
But unless they completely overhaul the rules in such a way that it would change the core gameplay, I don't think it would technically, or rather, I don't think it should ideally really tinker with those too much.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't assume, like, if you have a base system and you say that you're going to tweak it, like, I guess I'll take it back to 3, because you're probably more familiar with that, 3 and 3.5. Do you know of any cases of an adventure that was built for 3 that was no longer usable when you got to 3.5?
I don't know on hand. I don't know any that were built for 3 that could not be used in 3.5. But I also, when I was playing 3.5, I don't think I did any adventure modules.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I mean, there was quite a library, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, and I never used any of them.
And you don't have to. You're not under
back in those days, Nathan.
Yeah.
Back in those days, my DMs were very combat heavy, not very roleplay oriented, and kind of on the seat of their pants at all times.
Were you kind of working off of your wargaming background?
No, it was just high school days.
Okay. And
very informal, just kind of like, oh yeah, we're gonna go kill a lot of things.
Yeah. And you really engaged with the combat system.
3.5 had a wonderful combat system. It was nice and crunchy the way we like it.
Yeah.
And all those skills made it so you could really niche down into a specific skill if you wanted to.
Oh, you gotta niche down. You're so much better than niching up, I can tell you that. The thing is, 5, like, not having a lot of experience, but 5e always felt like it was definitely a little more story driven.
Definitely.
Okay, so it's not just me.
No.
And
they added the backgrounds, the flaws, the bonds, and the ideals to the character sheet in 5e.
Right.
I don't know if they had it in 4, but I know that's in 5, and they added that because it helps to flesh out roleplay and character development.
Right. In terms of what they're supposed to be doing for the new edition, which, by the way, is 2024, it's supposed to be coming out, we don't really know exactly what the modifications to this system are going to be, but according to executive producer Ray Winninger, hope I'm saying that right, when he was talking at the panel, they are working on basing this off of community feedback. So in that way, it kind of feels, honestly, like if they were looking at 5e as their initial release, they are now doing some patches and modifications, if we were looking at this in video game terminology.
I mean, yeah, they've done a bunch of those over the course of the lifespan of 5e already, where they're like, okay, this didn't quite work the way it should. Here's, I think, the Unearthed Arcana stuff, for instance.
Sure.
And it's just the FAQs generally that they put out for things like that are, hey, this isn't working the way it was supposed to, and this works this way, not the way it is in the book, so use this.
Right.
Deal.
Right.
So I know they put one of those out for the Ranger, I believe, in 5e.
Okay.
Because as written in the book, it's like, oh, the Ranger is really underperforming. I believe is what it was, compared to other classes. So they're like, let's do some quick changes.
This is the difference between buffing and nerfing your classing, essentially. So they needed to buff the Ranger.
Yeah, they need to make him more compatible? Not compatible. More on par.
Yeah, they had to get him up to a level where the other classes were. He was underpowered.
I think he was the least played, perhaps.
Okay.
Could probably look it up.
Yeah. We probably could. But anyway, in 2024,
that'll be a Friday follow-up. Remember when we talked about the Ranger?
Remember that Ranger thing that we did once upon a time? Yeah, like they said they didn't really say that this was 6e. This is not really supposed to be that, but then again, it doesn't really seem like it's a whole new version. And it probably, the reason why they don't have a big interest in doing a 6e right now is because 5e really has reinvigorated Dungeons and Dragons in the mainstream, where, you know, especially with the amount of streaming and the mainstream appeal, especially that it's gotten recently, has been off of 5e because it's more accessible and it plays better, especially if you're in front of an audience. And I doubt that they want to really risk changing that, because if they came out with a new version, then they are indeed doing that. If it ain't broke, don't fix it, except, of course, for the things that they'd like to fix based on community feedback here.
Right.
Here.
If it ain't broke, don't fix it, unless the community says you need to change things, and then you fix it.
Then you fix it. Basically, don't reinvent the wheel, but you can put some nice, like, rhinestones on the wheel and make
it... you can put some baseball cards that hook to the spokes.
Yeah, that's perfectly fine. Yeah, it's a feature. Yeah, you bling out your wheel, and then you've reinvented the wheel. You don't have to reinvent the basic mechanics of it, but you can really shine it up quite nicely. So that looks like what they're doing. One of the things that we experienced in the Discord as a discussion, because that is what this segment is called, was a little back and forth we were getting from people that were talking about all the 5e that they actually bought, but in some ways did not play. Helicity had made mention that owns a lot of 5e, probably will never run it, may just pass whatever. This will be up entirely. And Datum, again, who shared the original post, said passed almost all of 5e, did by Ravenloft, might convert it to another system. There are just so many better systems out there. Wish they could get some real leverage in the market. And I think one of the more interesting comments I saw was actually from Helicity, where Helicity said, there's nothing wrong with 5e, it's just really, really safe, and that makes it so bland. Your thoughts on that? Do you think 5e is bland, maybe by comparison to earlier versions?
Earlier versions or other RPG systems?
Well, I mean, I suppose both. Like, when he's talking about 5e here, I feel like he's specifically stating that based on other versions of D&D, because it's specifying 5e, it's not specifying D&D.
Okay, well, I believe they did say that they played a bunch of 4e and liked it.
Yeah.
I've never played 4e, so I cannot base it versus that. I would say versus 3.5, it's not as crunch heavy.
Mm-hmm.
It's not as just combat oriented. But I don't see that as a bad thing. Coming at 5e from a 3.5 perspective, it is, yeah, I would say it's way more accessible. It's a lot easier to get into, and I would say it's safer in the fact that there's a lot of ways you can kind of come back from things going wrong, for instance, like your death saving throws and whatnot. But that's not a bad thing in my opinion, because it means people can engage with the system better in more fun ways that don't just punish them for doing something wrong. There's a lot more give, I think, to 5e than, say, 3.5.
Sure.
Where it's like, oh, I can't suddenly dump 20 skill points into stealth. Or, move silently. But now in 5e, you can say, all right, well, I have proficiency in stealth, which is a combination of your move silently and hide skills from before. So it's easier to be like, all right, well, I can sneak because I've got stealth, and it's not like, oh, I can move quietly, but I'm not very good at hiding.
Yeah.
And a lot of things like that, especially with skills, it makes sense to shorten that list up to make it easier to get into, and not quite as nitty gritty.
Okay.
As far as safe, yeah, I think 5e would generally be a bit safer than some other systems, whether that comes in the fact that it's not as deadly because of the aforementioned reasons I said, or because it's just a lot more in tune with the role playing. And by a lot more in tune, I don't mean that it really is emphasizing it heavily, but it does emphasize it more. I think it's also safer in that it is easier to introduce to newer players, and that makes it a safer bet for them to probably want to play it.
Right.
It's less likely, I think, to intimidate people as much.
Yeah. The accessibility factor, I feel, by its very nature, may make things feel a little bland and safe, only because it's trying to make it more accessible to a wider audience. If you had a very rigid system that was very mechanics heavy, it definitely wouldn't feel bland to somebody who's like adept at role-playing games, but it would be much harder to introduce people to, and I think it would be a lot harder to explain, especially to an audience, because I think 5e works really well as an audience-driven sort of role-playing game, which is why you see it so much on stream. It's used very well so that an audience that's even just watching passively can understand the rules pretty well. It's all presented pretty straightforward. It would be a little hard, I think, if, like, go back to the wargaming times, to explain to people Warhammer on the map while they're watching.
I don't know if there's many or any Warhammer streams, for instance, and I'm pretty sure if there were any right now, that Games Workshop would probably DMCA the shit out of you.
Possibly.
Because we
that's
need
a
to
whole
do that
thing.
topic at some point. But
later.
If you were to stream like Warhammer, I think the only people who would be watching that would be other people who play Warhammer.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because there's no sitting down and watching a Warhammer stream and understanding any of what's going on
Right.
without a foreknowledge of the rules to play the game itself.
Right. Right. And I guess I would also say that 5e, from my experience playing it, is really the safeness or the blandness of it is also determinant on the group that you are running it with and how you are actually utilizing the system. There are deeper mechanics that you could get into. There's nitty-gritty underneath if you really want it, but it's not necessary in order to play the game. I don't really need to know about, like, do I have the necessary components to cast a spell? Most people gloss over all of that. Do I have tremor sense, and what does that... Like, it's there, you can utilize it, but you probably don't need to, except in very specified cases. So, I'm going to make a prediction here. Predictions. That a lot of the community-based stuff is based on accessibility issues for people who are not necessarily adept at role-playing.
That and then probably some balance issues.
There's probably some crunchy issues about that from longtime players, and I imagine that the community feedback from a lot of new players, since it's grown, the community has grown exponentially in the last few years, about things that would be beneficial to new players as well. I think that that's what you're going to see. But yeah, you're right. For the old hats, there's some balance issues I'm sure they're going to be looking at too. I mean, it's nice that they're making a community issue out of it, only because it does seem like the success of it has been very much about building that community for Wizards and for Dungeons & Dragons, and it makes sense that they would want to encourage that more by just listening to the people that are now in it.
Right.
Instead of just making unilateral decisions. Feels like that was the problem in earlier iterations, is that they just kind of came out with new changes, and everyone was like, what? So I know that there are people that liked 4E a lot, but also the criticisms around it were, why'd they change this so much from 3E? So, but I guess we will not really know until we get more information. Hopefully they won't wait until 2024 to do that. Of course, who knows?
Who knows? I was screaming silently there, sorry.
I like the silent screaming. I like the Fusro da that I don't
Fusro.
have to... Yeah, the Fusro. Perfect. Looking forward to 2024. Looking forward to seeing what they do with the system. We don't know as much for right now. Until then, the conversation continues, and you can continue that over on our Discord channel.
You just cut out entirely for that end there after the conversation continues.
Oh, okay.
Also, you've got cat and dog right there.
Oh my god. I've got cat and dog. That's great. Kind of. Sort of.
See,
I can kind of see.
cuddling.
I
They're
see
cuddling.
that. That's good. That's good interneting right there.
Good internet stuff.